Hi, welcome to the Introduction to NetPoint training for the 2023 NetPoint GPM conference. I'm glad you could join us, and we're looking forward to taking you through the basics of how to create a NetPoint schedule. So let's go. At this point, you should be seeing NetPoint. As you can see, it's pretty straightforward. It's just a time scale, and you draw the schedule right on the time scale. It's an interactive graphical schedule, so it's very different than the classic kind of CPM schedules that you might see. You can see when I select this activity bar, the cursor turns into a crosshair, and the crosshair tells you the day of the week and the date. And that color coding, you can see that has to do with whether or not it's a working day or a non-working day. So red for non-working days and black for working days. So at the beginning, when you're first starting a NetPoint schedule, you create a new schedule, and it's going to come up and ask you some questions. Some of these questions are important to answer early on in the process. For instance, how do you want to calculate criticality? In GPM, we have a concept called drift, and drift is basically reverse float. So most CPM schedulers who are just starting to use NetPoint want to switch over to strictly a float calculation for criticality. Also important to take a look at what are the calendar dates and the project dates. You don't want the calendar dates to be much longer than the expected project, because then you're just wasting space with all that extra calendar you're not going to use. I'm going to leave this as it is. One thing to remember is your project dates have to be within the bounds of your calendar dates. So start date has to be after the start of the calendar, and the completion date has to be after the end. Before the end. And so if you haven't added any activities yet to your schedule, you can use autofill, and it will fill in your project dates based on your calendar. So once you have that selected, I'm just going to come up here and grab this yellow part of the bar and stretch out my calendar a little bit so it fills up the page. The next really important question you need to ask yourself is, what size do I want to print this out, if you do want to print it out? And the reason that's important is because NetPoint is WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. And so this particular size is 8.5 by 11. I'm going to go to my print setup screen, and I'm going to change to an Adobe printer. And then I'm going to change to a ledger sized printout, 11 by 17. And when I do that, you'll notice I start to get slide bars down here and a little bit more slide up here. And the reason is because now my paper is bigger. And WYSIWYG, that means that the overall project fits on the screen exactly for the same size as your paper. And it can be pretty painful if you decide later on you want to go back to 8.5 by 11. So you want to pick your paper size right up front. Another thing people run into sometimes is that they can't fit everything on one page. So in that case, we have the option to do tiling. And that means that you can basically do a banner print across or down or both. And that's very helpful if you need a little bit more room for planning. So now that my page is so big, I can't really plan and see everything. And so what I'm going to do there is go up to the zoom stretch and zoom factor. So you can shrink your zoom factor until you can see the whole page. And that can be helpful because sometimes when you're planning, you want to see everything that's going on, not just part of the page. The thing to remember is when you go to print, it's going to go back to 100%. And so you don't want to have the printout without changing back to 100% and doing the resets on both of these. And then take a look at your schedule and see how it fits. So I'm going to go ahead and grab an activity, and I'm going to stretch that out starting on 2/1/23. I'm going to stretch to the right, and then I'm going to release my button on the mouse and Then it's going to ask me for a description. And I'm going to say permits. So now you have permits up on your screen, and you can move that any way you want, up, down, all around. Next, I'm going to do clear site. And then one more activity in a line here, and I'm going to do foundation. One thing you may have noticed is that all of these are on the same line, and that's a unique quality of NetPoint and GPM, that you can add activities on the same horizontal line. You're not forced to do the waterfall. Now, right now, clear site could move over here and it won't affect anything because these activities are not logically tied together. But right now, I'm going to tie together permits and clear site and link them using the link button. And then I'm going to select clear site and foundation just by drawing a box around those two. And then I'm going to link those two. Another thing you might notice is these are not sliding back to the data date. That's because in NetPoint, we do planner's date, not early date. And so these can stay wherever you want them to be. And the recalculation is real time. No matter what you're doing, it's always recalculating. So there's no F9 button here. This is exactly the schedule you have. And if you start to move clear site backwards and you consume that gap, then it'll start to push permits. And same with foundation can start to push clear site. And if we bring the project start date up to the start there, and then we bring project end date over, eventually it's going to turn red. That red means that this is the critical path for the schedule. And while this is a very simple example, it's very helpful in a more complex schedule to be able to follow that red line through the schedule to determine your critical path. I'm going to make a couple changes here just to make it easier for us to see what's going on. So I'm going to start with changing the size of some of these. Let me add drift and float and total float. And then I'm going to increase the size of my font for my description. And I think that's all I wanted to do. So now you can see the descriptions a little bit better. And you can see here we've got the drift, float, and total float. And then I'm just going to take a minute and kind of describe those. I'll reset my zoom back so that everything's bigger and we can see it more clearly. Now, right now we have drift on the left, float in the middle, and total float all the way to the right. And that will always be true when you show any of those. That's how they line up underneath the activity. And as I was saying earlier, drift is a reflection of how many days you can move to the left on the time scale without impacting the start of the schedule. So you can see here, if we pull permits off, then it's going to recalculate. So we have 8 days of drift. We have 1 day of float and 9 days of total float. What that means is there's 1 day between the end of foundation and the project completion date. And also, it means that our total float is always a reflection of drift plus float. So in NetPoint, that's how you can calculate those things. If we bring this up to that date, so the project starts on project start, and project end, project completion, we'll bring that back a day. And then, oh, I brought it back 2 days. No good. There we go. So now we've got triple zeros under all the activities. It's critical path, and it runs from project start to the project finish. Now I'm going to grab these activities and just move them down a couple grids, give myself a little bit of room to move around on the canvas. So starting with these all selected, the next thing I'm going to do is create a hammock. And a hammock is just a representation of all the activities or objects, could be milestones or benchmarks that you've selected, and then you add them into a hammock. So I'm going to call this phase 1 of our project. And now we have a hammock available, phase 1. Bring that down here. And anything that changes inside the members of the hammock, then that will change the hammock as well. If those activities become non-critical, then the hammock becomes non-critical. The next thing I want to talk about is milestones. In NetPoint, we have finish milestones and start milestones. And to do a milestone in NetPoint, you just select that object and then drop it on the canvas. And I'll call this permits complete. Now, one important thing when you're dropping a milestone, if it's a finish milestone, it has to be after the date of the object that you want to attach it to. So I'm going to attach this to permits. It's after that date. I'm going to select that and then select permits and then link them together. And you'll notice that it snaps right to that finish date of permits. And any place that now permits goes, the milestone will follow. So just as an example, you can see it tracking along that way. Now, we've got finish milestones. We also have start milestones, and the same rules apply. They would have to be dropped before the start of the activity. And then they'll track along with that activity when you link them to the activity. So let's do that. Those link together, and that snaps. So now we have these two milestones. We have a hammock, and we have activities. So we kind of have 3 layers of this schedule in a different amount of density for each layer. And these can be helpful if you're looking for an executive summary at the top of the schedule, and then just the big phases or the big bars, hammocks, and then some more detail. Let's go back down and we can add a little bit more detail to this network that we're creating. We're going to create a start-to-start relationship. And in start-to-start, you can drop a embed, we call it, right on an activity. So this is saying that this start-to-start object is going to be 12 days after the start of ClearSight. And then you can tie another object to that. So I'm going to create an activity here below and call it fencing. And then I'm going to link that activity directly to that object, that embed. And what that's going to do then is create that start-to-start relationship between fencing and that link. So then that can actually become a driver on the network. If fencing, for some reason, tried to push backwards, it's going to start pushing the whole network at this point. Or on the other hand, if ClearSight starts pushing forward, it's going to push everything after it plus fencing along with it. And this is kind of the beauty of the GPM network capabilities, is that you have that instant interaction between NetPoint and the planning group. Plus, everybody in the room can work on this schedule together and see the results. And they don't have to be scheduling experts to understand this graphic, which is very helpful. Next up, I'm going to talk about benchmarks. For those of you who are familiar with P6, this would be like a constrained milestone in P6. And so we'll call this end phase 1. And then if I tie end phase 1 off to the end of foundation, let's see what happens. These benchmarks are very useful for things like contract dates, things that just are not going to move. Think of it as the opening day of the Olympics. Now, something kind of funny happened here. We used to have 9 days of float, and then all of a sudden we have 4 days of float. And the reason is because a benchmark is terminal to float. And this is a great way if you're going to have multiple phases in a project. If you tie off the end of each phase to a benchmark, then you can conserve the float for later phases. You can apportion float across the project, which can be very helpful. We also have the ability to add text boxes. So for instance, we could say here, we could add a text box and say, Greenfield site, no cleanup required. And then drag that down here, a little close to that. You can change the colors of bars. So for instance, maybe you want all of your phase 1 activities to be a certain color so that they're very obvious in the schedule. You can do that just by highlighting them, selecting them, and then you can go to the set properties. And then we'll just change the color to, let's go with blue, bluish. So this can also be helpful if you're building a schedule with different trades involved. Each trade appreciates having their particular trade identified by color, and that way they can see in the schedule where they're picking up work, where it's handed off, that kind of thing. So now we've got this kind of functional little network going, and we might want to add coding or resources, and all of that is possible within NetPoint as well. So let's create some codes, and in order to do that, I'm going to create some phase 2 activities as well. So let me shrink my view a little bit, and you guys remember how to do that? That's the zoom stretch window. I'm going to zoom out a little bit to give myself a little more planning room. And then I'm going to add an activity over here, phase 2 activity. Oh, thank you for reminding me. NetPoint's great at reminding me when I forget what I'm supposed to do. You can't plan after the end of a project, so I'm going to scoot this over the project end date, and that way I can plan after phase 1. So phase 2, we're going to do foundation inspection, maybe, and steel delivery. So now we have these 2 activities. You'll notice they're not the same color, that blue phase 1 color. And you're probably asking yourself, as I'm asking myself, why isn't this one blue? And the reason is because I forgot to turn it blue. So let me do that. There we go. And I guess I'll do the same for these milestones as well. Okay. Well, that didn't work very well. Oh, because you know what? Let me show you that. So I went here and I said, oh, I want to change them to blue, and I changed this to blue, but I was on the activity tab, and I needed to be on the milestone tab. So just goes to show, it doesn't matter how experienced you are, sometimes you miss little things. You can see here too, a finish milestone has the color on the right, and a beginning milestone, a start milestone, has it on the left. So that's just another visual indicator. So now we're over here in phase 2. I'm going to link these 2 together. Finish the start, and I'll tie this foundation inspection off at the end of foundation. And then I'll create a hammock. The hammock is going to be phase 2 this time. Let's see, it looks like that's on maybe 8. Oh, it was on 7. Okay. Phase 2. There we go. Move that up so it's even with its partner over there. And then now that we have phase 2 and phase 1, I'm going to create some codes for us. So let's do that. We go to the Tools section and we open the Codes Manager. I'm going to create a new code, and that's going to be called phase. And then there are going to be 2 values within that code. First one is, anybody's guess, phase 1. And the next value will be phase 2. Now that we have those created, we can apply them to these activities, and then the activities will be coded. So let me reopen that. Here's how it appears with phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1, we have, let's see, clear site. End phase 1. Fencing. Oops, sorry about that, guys. Fencing, foundation, foundation start, permits, and permits complete. So that's all of our phase 1s. And then we're going to go to phase 2. And phase 2 was foundation inspection and steel delivery. Where's that in our list here? There we go, steel delivery. And we'll make phase 2 as well, part of that. Okay, so now you can close that. Then I'm going to show you one of the more powerful features in NetPoint, and this can work if you were to import an XER file from P6 and your P6 file had either coding or a work breakdown structure, then this same functionality that I'm about to show you will work in NetPoint, and it'll take the information that you brought in from P6 and use it. So I'm going to open the Layout Manager, and then I'm going to go to the Structure portion of the Layout Manager, and I want to derive lanes from my coding. And the coding I'm going to use is by phase, and so it's going to include phase 1 and phase 2. Then when I run that, it's going to sort the schedule by phase and then put it into its own individual swim lanes. So let's zoom in a little bit so we can get a better picture of what's going on here. And I already see it looks like I forgot to code something, but I might have done that on purpose just to reiterate to you guys how you can track on these things. So now we've zoomed in a little bit, and you can see on the left here, we've got the phase 1 activities, and then on the right, we've got phase 2, but they're in a different swim lane. The problem here is that I didn't code this to be one phase or the other. So I'm going to assign this to phase 1. And then I'm going to resort using the Layout Manager, using the structures, deriving lanes from phase, from codes, and then rerun it. And now we've got our phase 1 bar up here, and our phase 2 information, if I get this out of the way, we'll be able to see it, is down in the next swim lane. Now, I guess I'd rather the hammocks were up top, and there are ways to tune that, but that would be in the advanced class, not in the standard class. So the only other thing I really want to show you today has to do with creating resources. And resources in NetPoint, very straightforward, pretty simple implementation. For instance, we don't have resource curves available. You can't do a ramp up within a single activity. But it's a great way to take a look at basically big picture, what's going on with resources. A lot of our clients will use it for engineering hours, or for cash, like how much am I allowed to spend on a given day or a given month within the project, and just kind of lay that out. So let's go ahead and create a new resource. And it's very simple. You go to tools and then resource, and then we're going to create a new one. And we'll just call this spend. And spend is dollars. And there's $1 per unit. And then we're going to say, let's make it green to go along with the spend. So now we have that new resource built, and then we can start to assign that resource. So let's go through each of these and we'll assign a quantity of resource consumption based on the activity. Clearing the site, let's say that's going to be $10,000 a day. And over here in distribution, it's day versus duration. If you do it by duration, then the longer the activity goes, the lower your histogram will be, because you're spreading those dollars out over a longer period of time. If you do it by day, then it doesn't matter what the variation is in duration. The histogram is going to reflect that same $10,000 a day. Fencing, we'll do $2,000 a day. Foundation inspection, $1,000 a day. Foundation work, $15,000 a day. Permits, $500 a day. And steel delivery, let's call that $3,000 a day. So now we have resources assigned by quantity per day for all those activities. And so when we close these, you'll see here's my histogram showing my cash spend. And let's zoom out a little bit so we get the whole picture here. There we go. So now we got that cash spend. You can see if we were to move any of these activities, then the histogram will move with it. Oh, pardon me. The histogram will move with it. And that's where you can start to see some of the power here. So for instance, you can see our biggest spend is during foundation. And let's just say that we had a maximum spend per day on this project, mandated from corporate governance. We can't spend more than, this is $15,000. You can add, if you want to, you can take a look and add a scale so you can see that. So let's add a plot ruler. And there you can see 15,000 is the maximum that we are spending. So then we can set actually a maximum. And if we go over that maximum, then it will highlight it. So let's go and do that. We're going to go back to managing resources, and we're going to set a limit for those resources. And the spend is the limit. And then we just have to draw a line along this 15,000. And that will become our new maximum spend. So now that that's in place, what happens if we turn on the I'm over my spend? Well, nothing happens because you're not over your spend. But let's just say that we break this link here between the end of foundation and the start of foundation inspection, and we decide we want to do some of the inspection while they're finishing up the foundation. So we'll start at one end and we'll start inspecting. Well, now we have a problem because suddenly we're over our maximum spend, and that's highlighted here in our resource histogram where we set the spend limits. So that can just be a helpful way to level your cash flow or level your resources throughout a project using NetPoint. If you wanted to add a swim lane on your own, you can do that just by going here clicking on shades, and you can add a shade of any size or any shape that you want. If you want it to act like the shades that are here for a swim lane, then make it horizontal and canvas background, and then it will create that shade right across for you. That's our introduction to NetPoint. If you have questions, please feel free to contact us through the PMA Technologies website or directly, and we'll look forward to talking to you. Thank you.